It began with the sky splitting open. At first, we thought it was some atmospheric anomaly, northern lights gone rogue, a freak meteor shower, or one of those rare cosmic events that make astronomers salivate. But no, this was something else entirely. The air itself seemed to hum, a low vibration that rattled windows and sent animals into a frenzy. Midnight had come, marking the turn of the year to 2025, and with it came them. The first ship descended over the Pacific Ocean, a black silhouette against the stars. It was massive, larger than any human-made structure could ever hope to be, and it moved with an eerie grace, as though gravity itself bowed to its will. More followed, dozens at first, then hundreds, until the skies above every major city were crowded with their alien forms. They didn't fire weapons or send out demands. They simply hovered there, silent and inscrutable, like gods deciding whether to smite or spare. We didn't know what to do. Governments scrambled, militaries mobilized, scientists speculated wildly on live television. Some people prayed, others rioted. And then, as if to mock our chaos, they spoke. The message wasn't broadcast through radio waves or satellites. It was in us. Every human on Earth heard it simultaneously, a voice in our heads that was neither male nor female, but something in between, a perfect monotone that carried no emotion yet somehow felt ancient and commanding. Humans of Earth, it said, we are the Veyriss. We have come not to conquer, but to cleanse. Cleanse? The word hung in our minds like a guillotine blade. What do they mean by cleanse? The voice offered no elaboration before fading away, leaving us with only questions and a gnawing sense of dread. For 3 days, nothing happened. The ships remained motionless in the sky, casting long shadows over cities and countryside alike. People began calling it the longest midnight, as though time itself had stalled under their watchful gaze. Some dared to approach the ships. Planes flew close. Drones buzzed around their edges. But every attempt ended the same way: obliteration. Not with lasers or missiles, but with a pulse of energy that disintegrated anything within range. And then came the first strike. It started in Tokyo. One moment, the city was alive with its usual frenetic energy. The next, it was gone. A smoking crater where millions had lived and worked just seconds before. The Veyriss didn't target military bases or strategic locations. They targeted us. Civilians. Families. Entire populations wiped out in an instant. Panic spread like wildfire. Nations launched everything they had at the ships: missiles, fighter jets, experimental weapons we weren't supposed to know about, but nothing worked. Their technology was beyond anything we could comprehend, let alone counteract. But here's the thing about humans: we don't quit. Not when our backs are against the wall. Not when survival seems impossible. If there's one thing we're good at, better than any other species in the universe, it's fighting like hell when we've got nothing left to lose. The resistance began almost immediately. At first, it was scattered and disorganized, small groups of survivors banding together to hide or scavenge for supplies. But it didn't take long for humanity's innate stubbornness to kick in. We started fighting back in ways they didn't expect, hacking their systems using our primitive computers, sabotaging their ground operations. Yes, they had ground forces too. Even weaponizing our environment against them. And that's when we discovered their weakness. It wasn't some Deus Ex Machina solution, a single button we could press to make them all go away, but it was something uniquely human: unpredictability. The Veyriss were logical to a fault. Their strategies relied on precision and order. They couldn't understand chaos, the kind of chaos only humans could create. We turned cities into mazes of traps and ambushes, luring their ground forces into battles they couldn't win. We used guerrilla tactics that defied every rule of warfare they'd ever encountered. And slowly but surely, we began to push back. But this wasn't just a war of weapons. It was a war of wills. The Veyriss underestimated us from the start. They saw us as primitive creatures unworthy of survival. And that arrogance would be their undoing. Because here's another thing about humans. When you threaten everything we love, our families, our homes, our very existence, we become something more than ourselves. we become relentless. This is not a story about how they came in peace or how we welcomed them with open arms only to be betrayed. This is a story about defiance, about what happens when an unstoppable force meets an immovable object called humanity. And let me tell you something, they may have come to cleanse us, but they didn't count on us cleaning house first. My name is Julius. I was a historian once, before the Veyriss arrived and turned the world on its head. Now, I suppose you could call me a chronicler of survival. I've seen humanity at its worst and its best, and if you'll indulge me, I'll tell you how we almost gave everything away to the stars. When the Veyriss first appeared, they didn't come with fire and fury. No, they came cloaked in benevolence, offering solutions to problems that had plagued us for decades, centuries even. They spoke to us through that eerie voice in our minds, promising peace and prosperity in exchange for cooperation. They claimed they had seen countless civilizations destroy themselves through infighting and greed, and they had arrived to save us from the same fate. It was hard not to believe them. The world was a mess when they descended, wars raging across continents, political alliances fracturing under the weight of mistrust, and a planet groaning under the strain of climate change. The Veyriss claimed they could fix it all, and they did, or at least it seemed that way at first. Take Ukraine, for instance. The war there had dragged on for years, a brutal conflict that had claimed thousands of lives and left millions displaced. The Veyriss intervened with what they called conflict harmonizers, devices that emitted some kind of energy field capable of neutralizing weapons within a certain radius. Overnight, the front lines went silent. Soldiers dropped their guns and stared at each other across no man's land, unsure of what to do next. Similar devices were deployed in Gaza, Sudan, and other hotspots around the globe. In a matter of weeks, wars that had seemed endless were brought to a halt. But it wasn't just war they addressed. They tackled famine by introducing agricultural technologies that made deserts bloom with crops. They cleaned our oceans with machines that could filter out microplastics in days. They even stabilized global economies by sharing advanced algorithms that optimized resource distribution on an unprecedented scale. It was as if every problem we'd ever faced suddenly had a solution. And yet, something felt off. At first, it was easy to dismiss the unease as paranoia. After all, who wouldn't be suspicious when faced with beings so far beyond our understanding? But then came the whispers, stories of people disappearing after questioning the Veyriss too openly or refusing their gifts. Governments began to notice anomalies as well. Data blackouts in their most secure systems, strange patterns in global communications networks, and an unsettling uniformity in how conflicts were being resolved. You see, the Veyriss didn't just end wars. They erased the reasons for them, or so it seemed. Territorial disputes were settled by redrawing borders according to their calculations. Ideological divides were bridged by what they called cognitive realignment programs. People who once hated each other suddenly found themselves agreeing on everything, or rather, agreeing with whatever narrative the Veyriss provided. It wasn't peace, it was control. The turning point came when someone, an engineer from Brazil, whose name I'll never forget, managed to disable one of their conflict harmonizers long enough to examine it up close. What he found was chilling. These devices weren't just neutralizing weapons. They were emitting signals designed to manipulate human thought patterns. The Veyriss weren't solving our problems. They were rewriting them. By then, it was almost too late. Most of humanity had fallen under their sway, convinced that the Veyriss were our saviors. But a few of us saw through the facade, scientists, soldiers, journalists like me, and we began to resist in whatever ways we could. Looking back now, I can see how clever their deception was. They didn't conquer us with force. They made us want to be conquered. They preyed on our deepest fears and desires, offering solutions so perfect we forgot to ask what the cost might be. But here's the thing about humans. We don't like being told what to think. Not for long, anyway. And once we realized what was happening, well, let's just say the Veyriss underestimated how stubborn we can be when our freedom is at stake. That's another story for another time. For now, just remember this. Peace isn't something you can be given. It's something you have to fight for, even if that fight starts with yourself. I remember the exact moment it began. The air felt wrong, charged with an electric tension that made the hairs on my arms stand up. It was as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for something inevitable and terrible to unfold. We had been living under the shadow of the Veyriss for months by then, lulled into a false sense of security by their promises of peace and prosperity. But on that day, what we now call Catastrophe Day, their masks slipped and we saw their true faces. It started with a global broadcast, not in our heads this time, but on every screen, every device capable of displaying an image. The Veyriss appeared as shimmering, humanoid figures of light, their forms too perfect to be real. They spoke in unison, their voices echoing across the planet. Humans, they said, your compliance has been noted. The cleansing will now begin. The word cleansing hit like a thunderclap. We had heard it before, whispered in their initial messages, but no one had dared to ask what it truly meant. Now we understood. The Veyriss had never come to save us. They had come to erase us. The first targets were our satellites. In a matter of minutes, every piece of technology orbiting Earth was obliterated by precise bursts of energy from their ships. Communication networks collapsed. GPS systems failed. The world was plunged into a digital darkness we hadn't experienced in decades. Panic spread like wildfire as people realized how dependent we had become on those invisible threads connecting us. Next came the power grids. Entire cities went dark as the Veyriss unleashed electromagnetic pulses that fried electrical systems beyond repair. Hospitals lost life support. Planes fell from the sky. Nuclear reactors teetered on the brink of meltdown before automated safety protocols kicked in. Those that still worked anyway. But it wasn't just technology they attacked. They targeted us directly. Their ground forces descended from their hovering ships like specters from some ancient nightmare. These weren't soldiers in armor or machines bristling with weapons. They were something else entirely. Fluid, adaptable forms that moved with unnatural speed and precision. They didn't kill indiscriminately. They selected their targets with chilling efficiency. Leaders, scientists, engineers. Anyone who might pose a threat to their plans. By midday, half the world's major cities were burning. New York, Tokyo, London, Moscow, all reduced to smoldering ruins within hours. The death toll was unimaginable, but what struck me most was the silence that followed each attack. No screams, no cries for help. Just an eerie stillness as if the world itself was mourning. And yet, amidst the chaos and destruction, something remarkable happened. Humanity refused to go quietly. In Paris, firefighters used old analog radios to coordinate rescue efforts when all other communication failed. In Mumbai, fishermen turned their boats into makeshift evacuation vessels to ferry survivors across flooded streets. In Sao Paulo, gangs and police, sworn enemies just days before, worked side by side to defend neighborhoods from Veyriss ground units. It was as if Catastrophe Day stripped away all the petty divisions that had plagued us for so long. Race, religion, politics, and reminded us of what we truly were. Human. I saw it firsthand in my own city. When the power went out and the streets descended into chaos, I expected violence and looting. Instead, I saw neighbors sharing food and water, strangers helping each other navigate through the darkness, children comforting each other with songs and stories passed down through generations. But even as we banded together, we knew it wouldn't be enough, not against them. The Veyriss were relentless, methodical in their destruction. By nightfall, they had begun deploying what we later called harvesters, massive machines that scoured the land for resources while emitting waves of energy that rendered entire regions uninhabitable for humans. Forests turned to ash, rivers boiled away, entire ecosystems vanished in seconds. And yet, we fought back. It started small, pockets of resistance using whatever they could find, old rifles, homemade explosives, even bows and arrows in some cases. But those early acts of defiance sparked something larger, a movement that spread like wildfire across the globe. I remember one moment in particular. A group of farmers in Kansas rigged their tractors with explosives and drove them straight into a harvester machine while blasting Born to be Wild from ancient speakers strapped to their vehicles. It didn't stop the machine entirely, but slowed it down long enough for others to escape, and inspired countless others to do the same. By dawn on January 1st, 2025, the first day of what should have been a new year filled with hope, the world was unrecognizable. Cities lay in ruins. Billions were dead or displaced. Entire nations ceased to exist as political entities. But humanity? Humanity endured. Because here's the thing about us. No matter how advanced or powerful our enemies may be, they can never understand what makes us who we are. The stubbornness that refuses to give up even when all seems lost. The ingenuity born out of desperation. The unbreakable bonds forged in shared suffering. Catastrophe Day was meant to be our end, a final chapter written by beings who saw themselves as gods. Instead, it became our beginning, a rallying cry for a species that had spent too long divided by its own fears and flaws. We didn't know it then, not fully. But Catastrophe Day marked not just our darkest hour, but also the moment when humanity began its fight for survival, and its ultimate victory over those who sought to erase us from existence. The strategy didn't come all at once. It wasn't one grand plan conceived by a single genius in a secret bunker. No, it came together like humanity itself, messy, chaotic, and stitched from 1,000 desperate ideas. It was born in the ashes of Catastrophe Day, when the world had been brought to its knees, but refused to die. It was forged by scientists working in labs lit by candlelight, soldiers fighting with scavenged weapons, and ordinary people who refused to let the Veyriss write the final chapter of our story. The first breakthrough came from biologists. As the Veyriss decimated our cities and infrastructure, they left behind traces, fragments of their technology, biological samples from their ground forces, and even the occasional corpse of their soldiers. These fragments were studied obsessively by anyone with access to a microscope or a lab bench. What they discovered was both horrifying and hopeful. The Veyriss were not invincible. Their biology was alien, but not immune to Earth's ecosystem. Microorganisms, bacteria, fungi, even viruses had begun to infiltrate their systems. The Veyriss were advanced beyond anything we could comprehend, but their bodies had never encountered the microbial onslaught of Earth. They had no immunity to our pathogens, no defenses against the invisible armies that lived in every drop of water and every breath of air. This became humanity's first weapon, biology. Scientists began cultivating strains of Earth's most aggressive microorganisms, tailoring them to exploit the vulnerabilities in Veyriss physiology. It wasn't just about creating a disease, it was about creating chaos. The Veyriss operated with precision and control. Introducing unpredictability into their systems disrupted their entire operation. But biology alone wouldn't win the war. The second breakthrough came from engineers and hackers who had been scavenging alien technology since the invasion began. At first, reverse engineering seemed impossible. Their devices operated on principles that defied human understanding. But then someone realized that we didn't need to understand everything. We just needed to find ways to break it. Using rudimentary tools and salvage parts, these engineers began developing electromagnetic pulse, EMP, devices capable of disrupting Veyriss machinery. The aliens' technology relied heavily on advanced energy fields and quantum computing. EMPs short-circuited their systems long enough for humans to strike back. These devices were crude and dangerous. Half the time they blew up in our faces, but they worked. The third piece of the strategy came from an unlikely source: history. Military tacticians began studying ancient wars, looking for lessons that could be applied to this new kind of conflict. They found inspiration in guerrilla warfare, the kind of asymmetrical tactics that allowed smaller, weaker forces to defeat larger, more powerful enemies. The Veyriss were superior in every measurable way, but they couldn't predict human ingenuity or adapt as quickly as we could. Resistance cells around the world began coordinating their efforts using old-fashioned methods. Couriers on foot or bicycle, coded messages broadcast over shortwave radios, even carrier pigeons in some cases. They struck where the Veyriss least expected it, ambushing patrols in dense urban environments, sabotaging supply lines with homemade explosives, and luring ground forces into traps designed to exploit their weaknesses. And then there was Project Chimera. This was the brainchild of a coalition of scientists and military leaders who realized that humanity's greatest strength lay in its diversity, not just biologically, but intellectually. Project Chimera brought together experts from every field imaginable. Physicists working alongside farmers, hackers collaborating with poets, biologists teaming up with demolition experts. Their goal was simple: create something so unpredictable, so uniquely human, that the Veyriss couldn't counter it. What emerged from Project Chimera was a hybrid strategy that combined all our strengths. Biological warfare tailored to exploit alien vulnerabilities, EMP devices designed to disable their technology, guerrilla tactics that turned every city into a battlefield, and psychological operations aimed at sowing confusion among their ranks. But perhaps the most important aspect of Project Chimera was its philosophy: adapt or die. The Veyriss operated like a machine, efficient but rigid. Humanity thrived on chaos and creativity. Every time they adapted to one of our strategies, we came up with something new. By mid-2025, humanity had gone from prey to predator. Resistance cells were no longer just surviving. They were winning battles. Entire cities were reclaimed from Veyriss control. Their ground forces began retreating under relentless human attacks. Even their ships in orbit showed signs of strain as our biological weapons infiltrated their systems. But victory came at a cost. Millions more died as humanity pushed back against its invaders. Entire regions were rendered uninhabitable by our own weapons or by the Veyriss' desperate countermeasures. And yet we pressed on because we knew there was no alternative. I remember standing on a rooftop in what used to be Chicago, watching as one of their massive harvesters collapsed under its own weight after being infected with a strain of engineered fungus designed specifically for its materials. It fell like a dying beast, its once impenetrable shell crumbling into rust-colored dust. That night, for the first time since Catastrophe Day, I felt something I hadn't felt in months: hope. The strategy wasn't perfect, it never would be, but it was ours. It was messy and improvised and held together by sheer willpower, but it worked because it embodied everything that made us human. Our stubbornness, our creativity, our refusal to give up even when faced with impossible odds. The Veyriss came here thinking they would cleanse us from existence like some cosmic janitor wiping away dirt from a window pane. Instead, they found themselves facing something they couldn't understand, something they couldn't defeat. They found us. And we weren't going anywhere. The strategy was born not from hope, but from desperation. By mid-2025, humanity had clawed its way back from the brink of annihilation, but the Veyriss still loomed above us like gods of destruction. Their ships hung in the skies, their ground forces scoured our cities, and their harvesters continued to strip Earth of its resources. Yet, in the chaos of war, we began to see cracks in their omnipotence. They weren't invincible. They had weaknesses subtle hidden but there. The first clue came from a biologist named Dr. Elena Marquez. She had been working with a team in the ruins of Sao Paulo, studying samples taken from a fallen Veyriss soldier. The alien's physiology was bizarre, an intricate blend of organic tissue and what appeared to be biomechanical enhancements. But what caught her attention was the presence of Earth bacteria in the tissue. The Veyriss were infected. At first glance, it seemed insignificant, just a few strains of common bacteria that had infiltrated their systems. But then Marquez noticed something else. The bacteria were thriving. The Veyriss immune system wasn't just unfamiliar with Earth pathogens. It was fundamentally incompatible with them. Their advanced biology had no defense against the microbial life that saturated our planet. This discovery changed everything. Marquez's team began cultivating strains of bacteria and viruses specifically tailored to exploit vulnerabilities in Veyriss biology. It wasn't easy. Their physiology was so alien that even our most aggressive pathogens struggled to adapt. But over time, they developed what they called biological disruptors, microorganisms engineered to attack the Veyriss at a cellular level. Meanwhile, another breakthrough came from an unlikely source: an old Soviet bunker in Siberia. A group of engineers and hackers had been reverse engineering pieces of alien technology salvaged from battlefields. They discovered that the Veyriss relied on a form of quantum communication to coordinate their forces, a network so advanced it made our internet look like cave paintings. But this network had a flaw. It was centralized. Every signal passed through a single point, a hub buried deep within their motherships. If that hub could be disrupted, their entire system would collapse into chaos. The problem was getting close enough to do it. That's where Project Chimera came in. Project Chimera wasn't just a weapon. It was an idea, a culmination of everything humanity had learned about its enemy. It combined biological warfare with cyber sabotage and guerrilla tactics into a single coordinated strategy. The goal was simple: cripple their network, infect their forces, and turn their own technology against them. The first phase involved deploying biological disruptors on a massive scale. Resistant cells around the world began releasing clouds of engineered pathogens into areas controlled by the Veyriss. These disruptors didn't kill outright. Instead, they caused systemic failures in both organic and mechanical components, slowing their movements and weakening their defenses. The second phase targeted their communication network. Hackers worked tirelessly to develop viruses capable of infiltrating the Veyriss quantum systems. These digital weapons were designed not only to disrupt communication, but also to spread misinformation, tricking ground forces into attacking each other or retreating from key positions. But the most daring part of Project Chimera was its third phase: direct assaults on their motherships. This wasn't some Hollywood-style mission where a lone hero flew into space with a nuke strapped to his back. It was far messier and far more human. Teams of volunteers, soldiers, scientists, even civilians were trained for months in secret facilities scattered across the globe. They were equipped with modified alien tech scavenged from battlefields and loaded onto retrofitted spacecraft cobbled together from whatever humanity could find or steal. Their mission? Board the motherships and destroy the hubs controlling the Veyriss network. It was suicide and everyone involved knew it. But they went anyway because they understood what was at stake. Not just survival, but freedom itself. I remember watching one of those teams launch from an old NASA facility in Florida. The rockets weren't sleek or elegant. They were patched together with duct tape and prayers, shaking violently as they rose into the sky. But as I stood there among the crowd of onlookers, farmers, refugees, children clutching handmade signs, I felt something I hadn't felt since Catastrophe Day: pride. We weren't running anymore. We were fighting back, and we were winning, slowly, painfully, but undeniably winning. The Veyriss had underestimated us from the start. They thought we were weak because we lacked their technology or unity. But what they failed to understand was that our greatest strength lay in our flaws, in our chaos, our stubbornness, our refusal to give up even when all seemed lost. They came here thinking they could cleanse us like dirt from a window pane. Instead, they found themselves drowning in an ocean of humanity, a relentless tide that refused to be swept away. This war isn't over. Not yet, but for the first time since it began, I believe we can win. Because no matter how advanced or powerful they are, they're not us. And that's their greatest weakness. By the end of 2025, humanity had transformed itself into something unrecognizable from the fractured, complacent species we had been before the invasion. The Veyriss had come to cleanse us, to erase us from existence. But instead, they had forged us into a single, united force, a species that refused to kneel. The war had dragged on for over a year, and though we had suffered unimaginable losses, we had also learned. We had adapted. And most importantly, we had found their weakness. The Veyriss were not gods. They were not invincible. They were advanced, yes, far beyond anything we could comprehend. But they were also arrogant. They relied on their technological superiority and their rigid systems of control. But humans? Humans thrived in chaos. We turned unpredictability into an art form. And it was chaos that would finally drive them from our planet. The turning point came when Project Chimera's final phase was activated. After months of relentless guerrilla warfare, biological sabotage, and cyber infiltration, humanity was ready to strike at the heart of the Veyriss war machine. The plan was audacious, borderline suicidal. But it was our only chance to end the war once and for all. The key lay in their motherships. The Veyriss fleet operated as a hive mind, with each ship acting as a node in a vast quantum network. At the center of this network were their motherships, massive vessels that coordinated every aspect of their invasion. If we could destroy or disable these ships, the entire Veyriss operation would collapse into disarray. But there was another layer to their vulnerability, one that we hadn't fully understood until late in the war. The Veyriss were terrified of exposure. Their entire society was built on secrecy and control. They operated in shadows, erasing any trace of themselves wherever they went. And now we knew why. Deep within their motherships lay what we called the core. It wasn't just a command center. It was a repository, a digital archive containing everything about the Veyriss. Their history, their biology, their technology, even the coordinates of their homeworld. If humanity could access this core and broadcast its contents to the galaxy, it would expose the Veyriss to every other advanced civilization out there. And they couldn't afford that. This revelation gave birth to Operation Prometheus, a desperate gambit to infiltrate a mothership, seize its core, and broadcast its contents using their own quantum communication network. It was a plan that required perfect coordination between Earth's remaining forces, resistance cells on the ground, scavenged spacecraft in orbit, and the remnants of our shattered militaries. The operation began with a diversion. Across the globe, resistance fighters launched simultaneous attacks on Veyriss ground forces and secondary ships. These weren't meant to win battles. They were meant to draw attention away from the real target, Erebus, the largest and most heavily guarded mothership in their fleet. While the Veyriss scrambled to respond to these attacks, a team of volunteers, scientists, engineers, soldiers boarded a stolen Veyriss dropship and made their way toward Erebus. The dropship had been retrofitted with human tech to mask its true origin, but even then, it was a one-way trip. Everyone aboard knew they wouldn't be coming back. The infiltration team breached Erebus under cover of chaos as Earth's orbital forces engaged the rest of the fleet in a desperate battle. Inside the mothership, they encountered resistance, Veyriss drones and soldiers swarming through labyrinthine corridors, but they pressed on. Armed with reverse-engineered alien tech and sheer determination, they fought their way to the core chamber. What they found there defied imagination. An immense crystalline structure pulsating with light and energy, a physical manifestation of the Veyriss hive mind. It wasn't just data. It was alive in some incomprehensible way. Activating the core wasn't easy. The team had to bypass layers of security while fending off waves of attackers. But eventually, they succeeded. The core's contents began broadcasting across the galaxy, an unfiltered torrent of information exposing every secret the Veyriss had tried so hard to keep hidden. The reaction was immediate. Other civilizations, some more advanced than even the Veyriss, took notice. The broadcast painted them not as gods, but as parasites preying on weaker worlds under the guise of cleansing them for some twisted sense of order. Within hours, messages flooded back through their own network. Warnings from other species promising retribution if they didn't withdraw immediately. The Veyriss panicked. Their ships began retreating almost immediately, abandoning ground forces and harvesters alike as they scrambled to escape Earth's orbit before more damage could be done. On the ground, humans watched in awe as alien vessels vanished into the skies like frightened animals fleeing a firestorm. But humanity wasn't done yet. As Erebus tried to flee with its damaged core still broadcasting its secrets, Earth's orbital fleet delivered one final blow, a barrage of missiles, some nuclear, some improvised weapons loaded with biological disruptors, that struck deep into its hull. The mothership erupted in a blinding explosion visible from every corner of Earth. And, just like that, they were gone. The war was over. In the days that followed, humanity began picking up the pieces. Cities lay in ruins. Billions were dead or displaced. Entire ecosystems had been devastated by both alien weapons and our own desperate countermeasures. But for all our losses, for all our pain, we had survived. And more than that, we had won. The broadcast from Erebus ensured that no other species would dare attempt what the Veyriss had done. Not against us. We were no longer just another primitive race ripe for conquest. We were something else entirely. Survivors who had faced extinction and refused to go quietly into oblivion. As I write this now, years later, I can still see them. The last trails of light as their ships disappeared beyond our atmosphere forever. They came here thinking they could cleanse us like dirt from a window pane. Instead, they found themselves broken against an unyielding force called humanity, a force that thrives in chaos and turns desperation into strength. We are scarred but stronger than ever before. They will never return, not because they fear us, but because now we are watching them.